Going into this season, the Bundesliga's media tagline was "Football as it's meant to be."
The setting, of course, a familiar look and a completely unfamiliar feel. As a former Dortmund boss said, football is the most important of the least important things right now.
On Saturday, the Bundesliga resumed after taking a long break due to the emergence of coronavirus. Whatever else it was, this wasn't how it was meant to be.
Guerrero again. Haaland, great little ball from him. Guerrero went on and on. He tucked it in. And he celebrates again. And it's just one beautiful moment after another. They can't hug him as much as they want to. And the smile is worth it.
In the Revierderby, Borussia Dortmund romped home to a 4-0 victory over their rivals Schalke. But not everybody was happy.
I'm standing right by a red and white sign here, Max, just before this big sign which says Stadion here, meaning stadium. And this sign, which has been put up by some Cologne Ultras, says "Stop the leagues here and now."
In this episode, we ask, was the Bundesliga's return a success? Or will the shine soon wear off?
On the one hand, I was pretty happy to be back covering football because obviously that's my job and I enjoy doing that.
Sebastian Wessling is a football journalist for Funkesport and was at the stadium covering Dortmund on Saturday.
But on the other, it was quite bizarre considering the whole setting, the surroundings, the strict rules and also the atmosphere on the pitch.
Could you tell us a little bit about the run-up to the game? Were you given much information and preparation by the Bundesliga?
Well, not really huge. We got a letter from Borussia Dortmund beforehand, which stated all the rules we had to adhere to. We got a questionnaire where we had to tick off that we weren't infected with COVID-19, that we hadn't met anyone who was infected, and stuff like that, and a little more technical information about where we had to park and where we had to sit and the minimum distance we had to keep, but the information wasn't overwhelming.
Tell us about your journey to the stadium. How was it different to your previous journeys there?
It was very, very different. First of all, we had a different parking space, which wasn't that huge a difference. But then before entering the stadium, where normally our stuff is checked, our temperature was checked in order to avoid people with a COVID-19 infection to enter the stadium. We couldn't access all the parts of the stadium, only a very, very small fraction. The working area where we normally do our work, where the press conferences are, that was closed. So we only had the press stand where we could work. There was no mixed zone after the game. There was no post-match press conference. That was only done via video. So yeah, it was quite a different experience.
So you arrive at the stadium, you have to go through security. Can you talk us through the process of making your way to your seat from the entrance?
I exit my car. I walk up to this place where the temperature is taken. My temperature is taken. I did qualify for entering the stadium, 36.9. So everything was fine. Then this machine where I can get my hands disinfected. And then, I walk up to the press stands. There's security all over the place showing me where to go. Take a few steps, turn to the left, and then I'm on the press stand. It's actually quite a direct route I can take there. So not a lot of searching and looking involved. I know the place quite well. I had a different seats than usually. So all the seats were given out news in order to enable people to keep minimum distance. Not all that complicated a process, really.
Would you say it was easy to keep your distance from people?
I was totally able to safely distance. Yeah, we were only 10 journalists on the press stands. So normally it's more than 100. So it's pretty easy to keep distance there. We all sat 3 or 4 seats apart. So that was really not a big problem.
What was it like being in the press box?
It was hugely different. Normally there's a lot of chattering going on. We compare our impressions the whole time. We stick together. We look at something. We look at a certain part of text. We sit quite closely together. All that was different. We were quite far apart. One almost had to scream to talk to the colleagues. Yeah, so it was hugely different from the normal working impression. Everyone more or less by himself, whereas usually we have a lot of exchange going on.
And did you feel safe in the stadium?
I felt absolutely safe, yes. Well, absolutely maybe is too big a word because there's always a little risk remaining, but I could keep distance from my colleagues, from all other people the whole time. I was outside in the air, which obviously is less a risk than being in a congested room, so I didn't feel worried at all to contract an infection.
Fußballtempel Allianz Arena. Kein Fußball, keine Stimmung. Unterwegs mit Alexander Fischer, Pressesprecher des FC Bayern Fanclubs Club Nummer 12.
Persönlich finde ich Geisterspiele echt total beschissen. Mir fehlt da einfach alles. Mir fehlt der Gang zum Stadion, mir fehlt die Atmosphäre, die auch im Fernsehen nicht rüberkommen wird.
In Germany, they call these games behind closed doors Geisterspiele or ghost games. Have you ever covered a Geisterspiel before?
That was my first time at a real Geisterspiel. I have covered a lot of pre-season friendly matches, which were sometimes similar considering the atmosphere, but not in a stadium like this without spectators. That was a first for me.
How is the experience of covering a competitive game in an empty stadium?
It was very bizarre. It sounds like a Sunday morning kick by some amateurs somewhere in a park. You can hear every shout, everything the coaches explains to his players. You can hear all the players shouting, like go, 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 run, stay deep, everything you normally don't hear. No spectators being there, not a single sound being made from the stands. It feels hugely different. I couldn't imagine beforehand that it would be that big a difference, but it really was. It was even sort of difficult to concentrate and to get this match feeling on the press stand because the whole acoustic input was missing.
There was an article which came out in The Guardian today with a journalist who'd gone to one of the Bundesliga games, and he had pointed out how much journalists rely on the crowd in order to focus on the game. So I wondered if there was any areas in which you felt as though the empty stadium had an impact on the way that you were watching the game.
Totally. That's a very interesting point because nowadays we have to work a lot during the game already. We produce text for our webpage. And so normally the acoustic input from the crowd really helps. Sometimes you will be looking at your screen, typing something or checking something, and then you hear there will be an uproar in the crowd and you will be looking up and, oh, what's going on? All this didn't happen, so you have to focus a lot on the play itself. We sort of had the impression sometimes that also the players play maybe a little differently without a crowd being there. Maybe a bit more playfully, a bit more trying some more crazy things, the backheel stuff, which maybe you wouldn't do if there's a whole stadium that will be starting to shout and complain on the first mistake you make.
Once the final whistle went, how long did you stay in the stadium?
A little more than an hour. We had a WhatsApp group that was set up before with all the journalists in the stadium where we then could pose our questions to the coaches for the post-match press conference. And then the video would be streamed for us on the press stands and we could watch the post-match press conference up there. So I stayed for that. I watched that. And after that, I left the stadium, I would say 75 minutes after the final whistle.
And how does that post-match routine differ from your usual post-match routine?
That's hugely different. Normally, once the whistle blows, usually I'm there with a colleague of mine who works for the same paper, and one of us will really hustle down to the mix zone to catch the players once they exit the pitch, to talk to them. The other one will go to the press conference room, wait for the coach, and so we stay there, we work a lot there, we catch a lot of impressions, we talk to players, we talk to coaches, and then we produce quite a lot of text there. So usually I wouldn't have left the stadium before at least, say, 9 p.m. or even 10 p.m. That time was really drastically cut short.
According to various polls, the German public have largely been against the return of the Bundesliga before this weekend, and I think the unfavourability was rising week on week until the point at which the Bundesliga came back. Do you get a sense that the public opinion is shifting?
Well, I don't know if the general impression will be shifting, but what I found quite interesting was that Sky, the TV partner, put up record figures. More than 6 million people watched the games, and that is double almost than the previous record. So there is a huge interest, obviously. I can imagine that even the general public opinion will shift now once it is seen that the games will be carried out in relative safety. Although all that could change if there was a number of COVID-19 infections now coming from players, coaches, staff, I guess that would change dramatically. But I would imagine that public opinion will now gradually shift back to allowing the Bundesliga to continue playing.
What about your own assessment of the success of the Bundesliga return? How well do you think it went?
My assessment is split, really. I think from a technical point of view, it was pretty successful. The concept seems to work. It is a very strict concept they have put in place, and I think it's a well thought out concept, and all the technical stuff really worked. The whole processes around it worked and seemed to be sensibly. But I thought the Geisterspiel atmosphere, without fans being there, without the usual excitement, without the usual emotions, an experience which missed everything which belongs to football, in my opinion. From that point of view, you cannot really talk about a success, but the main game of the clubs and of the governing body was to bring back play, and if you look at it from that standpoint, it was a success.
However much money may dictate, the game of football remains a spectacle. With the Bundesliga back, the question has to be, just how entertaining was it?
My expectations are probably different than that of a fan. Most of my viewing is more of the professional or analytical type.
Abel Meszaros is a Bundesliga analyst who works for Sport TV Hungary.
There was a little bit of the sort of scrimmage, sort of training match feel to certainly some of the games, especially like the latter parts of like the second half of the game as players got more tired. But yeah, it was also strange with not having any kind of atmosphere, and you could hear all the players and some of the tactical instructions. It was fun.
So the big question on everyone's lips was, how much did the break for coronavirus affect the quality of the game? How did you feel about the quality when you were watching this weekend?
I thought it was pretty good. I think people probably had lower expectations. Like, for example, I think in the Bayern Union game, Union covered like 123 kilometers, which is a pretty phenomenal distance and intensity measure. Some of the things were like, I think in the Köln-Mainz game, the second half was just so wide open and it just looked like no team had a midfield. I think you can certainly call into question what Schalke were doing pretty much after the first 5 minutes in terms of the lack of quality. Or even like Frankfurt had some problems, but overall, I think it was fine. Almost like a regular sort of Bundesliga weekend, which considering these players had trained probably, regular training a week, maybe even 8 days tops, it's actually quite amazing.
Did you notice fitness levels being an issue at all?
Yeah, there's a lot of guys getting cramps, like you saw Marcus Thuram, I think Bensebaini as well, Todibo, and when you try to get into a foot race with Ashraf Hakimi, which is, again, I mean, that's kind of on him, like, don't do that. You saw that also, I think, in the Frankfurt game where there was just massive substitutions, also like in the Köln-Mainz game, like Köln just seemed dead after 60 minutes, so definitely it was a pretty huge issue. One thing that I thought teams didn't do much of, or coaches didn't do that much of, is the game theory things of like substituting earlier and making sort of tactical switches even earlier. Like I think Nagel's one was pretty much like the only one who did halftime subs or early subs.
Another aspect of the Bundesliga return which might affect gameplay is the fact that some teams didn't have anything to play for. I noticed, particularly with maybe Eintracht Frankfurt.
Yeah.
I wondered whether or not you thought that actually had any impact, and did you notice any other teams who looked unconcerned this weekend?
Yeah, I think Frankfurt is probably the easiest one. Schalke theoretically had a lot to play for, but once the Schubert mistake came and Dortmund had gone up 2-0, you might have turned the game off, I think. Frankfurt for sure, like they just seemed like from the beginning they were a little bit out of it, and then they were unable to get back into it. I mean, part of that is probably down to Gladbach as well. I am still waiting to see like Augsburg, Wolfsburg, and Hoffenheim, Hertha, but from what I've been told, those were all like fairly intense and good games to watch. So I don't think so.
And what do you think about the managers? Do you think that the managers played simpler football rather than complex stuff as a result of the break?
I mean, to the extent that like the Bundesliga can be simple, I think there are a lot of really interesting tactical managers. So I don't think they necessarily like dumbed it down or anything like that. There are more like cautious, I think, approaches with a lot of back fives, like basically Schalke used the back five, Freiburg used the back five. Situationally, sometimes Mainz would use it. Union, of course, used the back five. So that's more of like a season-long trend of teams being perhaps like the Bundesliga is not being that sort of high-pressing league anymore. That used to be its calling card, but I think not necessarily anymore. There were some interesting deployments, like I think Paderborn were using Christopher Antuajai, who's a winger, as like a number 8, and they played like 3 wingers, and this is the lineup, and I was like, what is Stefan Baumgart trying to do? But, I would have to look at that game in more sort of detail to assess that. I think a lot of the tactical tweaks were more out of necessity, like Favre had to make do with a lot of injuries for Dortmund, but certainly like Mo Dahoud worked out really well, and putting Julian Brandt higher and not in central midfield was probably one of the keys to Dortmund winning the game. I liked Union Berlin using Grisha Prömel, who finally came back after a long injury. I thought he was a big key in keeping Thiago pretty quiet in the Bayern match, but most of the time, like most teams just ran their regular formations and made sort of similar tweaks. I don't think there was that much tweaking.
I guess there's going to be an issue with sample size here, but when we look at the league table for these Geisterspiele after the season is over, do you think that the two tables before and after the break will look hugely different? And do you think any teams are going to have benefited from the break in particular?
When this question was posed to me, like before this weekend, I thought that, obviously the teams with the most depth, so like Dortmund or even like Bayern, although their depth is more in quality, not necessarily in quantity, or even Leipzig would benefit, but it didn't seem to be that way. Like certainly, Dortmund benefited surprisingly because they had so many injuries. But in terms of the table, I think you could see Leipzig were already a pretty big losers to the extent that they had a smallish chance of still winning the league. I was among those people who said that those chances were kind of gone due to their form. Like I was just looking at it, that they drew the last 3 games now, and they had that same stretch of Freiburg, Wolfsburg, and Leverkusen, and got 2 points out of it at the same time in the fall. So I think they're kind of a losers. Beneficiaries, like you certainly think like Wolfsburg are one of those. Hoffenheim could have been, but now having lost so many games, basically 4 out of 6, they're pretty much out of it, and they might slide back into the we don't have that much to play for fake Europa League contenders. Those teams like Union Berlin, Eintracht Frankfurt, technically they're like trying to avoid relegation, but at the same time I feel like they're fairly safe with a good solid 4 or 5 points with like 8 matches to play.
You've already mentioned that RB Leipzig looked as though they could put pressure on Bayern, but they ended up dropping points. And I watched that game and I was quite interested in your opinion on Timo Werner, who is a striker who obviously relies on being reactive.
And here comes the counter. Kevin Campbell's pass, and Werner's away. Away from Diekmeyer, away from Sakai. Werner! Yet another goal from the red-hot Timo Werner.
He didn't look as though he was on form at all. Wondered if you had any thoughts on the way that the break will have impacted elite players. Do you think that there's anything in the sort of notion of a player who relies on sharpness actually losing out because of this break?
Yeah, that's probably a good way to think about it. I hadn't really conceptualized it that way. But it's like that extra few percent. And I think Werner, for him, I think a lot of times it's like confidence because he's a very, very streaky player. Just to give you like the example, when he was on fire, started the season with like, I think 8 goals or something in 5 games and then fell off for like 5-6 matches. And then when Leipzig ran that streak, he became the hottest striker. Like he was having per 90 minutes the numbers that were aligned with Lionel Messi. So like 1 expected goal and almost 1 goal a game. Since the Rückrunde has started, he's at like 0.3, which is kind of average to below average in the Bundesliga. So I think for him, he's been kind of off the pace for a while, and you wonder how much the transfer rumors and whatever. But I think he would be a good candidate for somebody who needs to be 100% sort of mentally and physically, and certainly that's not the case. So I think it could have impacted him. It didn't seem to impact Lewandowski. He seemed to be really, really sort of at top form. So I would agree with you that it seems like there's more impact, but the difference between Haaland and Werner play a different role because Werner under Nagelsmann is like a big ball progression and then drops back to pick up the play, and Haaland is almost exclusively a finisher at this point, although he does have like some combination play.
You've already mentioned that you're an analyst, so you're used to watching games as a professional. But what was your feeling about the Bundesliga's return as a spectacle? Do you think the fans are going to get tired of this new experience of football?
Yeah, that's an interesting way because, obviously I interact with a lot of people, just television, online and just talking to people. And the more I cover German football, I'm more sympathetic to the fan experience, which is, I think, what a lot of people are. And, certainly my perspective is somewhere in the middle where it's closer to the professional side in terms of watching it and trying to think of it that way and tactical and analytically. But I have a lot of time for that sort of viewpoint where it is for the fans and it is as much about the fans. And we understand why it had to be done, but it was a little bit lacking in some some sense, although I like the teddy bears with the Cologne scarves or the Gladbach cutouts, or, some of the things like the Bundesliga did try to do a good job. But there was sort of a existential hollowness, I guess, about these matches. There was a strange feeling about them. As are these supposed to be like exhibition matches? Because that's certainly the atmosphere and even some of the things you were able to hear. There was sort of intimacy about them because you could hear those things, but at the same time, you also missed sort of the crowd noise, which now makes it more sudden and more real. Numbers-wise, they did pretty well. And it was interesting how many people finished the matches versus how many of them sort of watched bits and parts of it.
Do you think the Bundesliga return was successful?
Yeah, ultimately, just in the sense that for the most part, it went off without a hitch, in the sense that there were not serious injuries or confrontations or any of those things that people can get scared of. So in that sense, yeah. Although at the same time, like the Bundesliga's appeal of being the fan-friendliest league and whatnot, this is a difficult look. But at the same time, I think one of my colleagues was saying that the Bundesliga is kind of the test pilot, to use like a Formula One metaphor, for the rest of professional football. And so I think to take that metaphor forward, this first lap was a successful one.
Sebastian Wessling is a football journalist for Funkesport. You can read Abel Meszaros' Bundesliga Bulletin over on Substack, or sign up for it in newsletter form. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or, if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.